Hello and welcome to our course all about boundaries and living more in alignment with your truth. First of all, thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to present this material to you. And if you haven't already, please make sure that you print off your workbook so you can follow along. If you don't have access to a printer at this time, feel free also just to pull it up on your computer, and that would be wonderful. Make sure as well that you check our webinar schedule, which is sent out through email at the beginning of every month and is also posted in our Facebook group and members lounge, where we have 2 or more live weekly webinars that you can tune into about all sorts of different topics, especially related to some of our course content already. It's a great space to ask questions, to connect with other like-minded people. And we also have a mastermind group that we've begun, where we have little breakout sessions between people, especially to create a lot of extra community support during sort of this time of isolation that's happening. So check out our webinar schedule, tune in live for these webinars. It's a beautiful time to interact with our community. I'm there to answer your questions live. And also, we have a Facebook group that will sort of add to that mix a little bit. So check out the Facebook group as well. And thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoy and get a lot out of this course today. So for today's itinerary, we are going to do a deep dive around boundaries as a whole. We're going to talk a lot about what boundaries are, why we've lost touch with our boundaries in the first place. We're going to discuss the art of considering ourselves when making boundary-based decisions. We're going to talk about why we fear setting boundaries, the different types of boundaries, the different types of boundary violations. We're going to discuss boundaries in all 7 areas of life, and do some exercises around how to identify what your boundaries are in each of the 7 areas. So for example, in your career versus in your family relationships or romantic relationships. We're also going to discuss the difference between a poor boundary cycle, where we set boundaries out of aggression, anger, or desperation, versus actual assertiveness, and the importance of how to set boundaries in real time so that we don't have to set boundaries out of a space of desperation and emotional triggering, because that actually makes for much less effective boundaries and for people respecting our boundaries less long term. Then we're going to go into some core belief and emotional patterns around what creates poor boundaries and talk about how to reprogram these things that are not serving us. So for example, if you're feeling that you don't deserve to have boundaries, we want to work on that belief so that that doesn't prevent you from actually doing the work to set boundaries in the meantime. And then we're going to go through sort of the meat of the course, which is the boundary identification process, step by step, how to know what your boundaries are, boundary communication process, how to express these to other people in a healthy way. And we're also going to touch on dealing with objections and exposure response reprogramming for changing our relationship to our boundaries overall. And we'll add a few bonus questions to identify boundaries at the end and talk a little bit about some visualization techniques. So you're going to get a lot of boundary information that dives very deep in this course. Stay tuned, and thank you so much for being here. So let's talk about what boundaries are. So first and foremost, your boundaries are essentially the imaginary line that separates you from others. And it's specifically your feelings, your needs, and your personal reality. So boundaries also show people how you want to be treated. If we don't have boundaries in our lives, we're naturally more likely to be taken advantage of. And this isn't always because people are bad and want to take advantage of you. A lot of the time it's because they respond unconsciously to the cues that you give to them, and they get adjusted to how you're showing up. So if you are always giving, always extending yourself, and not really asking for much in return, or even maybe hesitant to receive, that's how the person gets to know you. And then that's what they tend to unconsciously expect. And so we really teach people how to treat us with our boundaries. Now, if you have poor boundaries, this isn't your fault. Boundaries are very much a learned experience or an unlearned experience based on childhood and the different relationships that we're exposed to throughout the course of our lives. But a lot of what people tend to think of as boundaries in sort of the Western world is a separation, like a divider between me and you. And what I really like to think of boundaries as is more of a joining than a separation, because it's a more authentic expression of yourself. So rather than this separation of you being inauthentic to yourself and not showing up truthfully and honestly in a relationship, there really is this joining, because you are extending and bringing outwards your entire truth, your authentic self, who you really are, which gives you a greater opportunity to be seen, to be heard, to be understood in your relationships. And so it is this joining, because it's you truly showing up, tuned into yourself, and expressing honestly to others. And this is one of the most important things you can do, period, in your relationships. Your working relationships, your romantic partnerships, your family relationships. It is so important for the overall health and well-being to have boundaries and to express your truth. So you can think of boundaries as essentially an expression of your feelings, your needs, and your desires. And becoming masterful at setting boundaries really requires the art of you being able to tune into yourself while in the presence of others. And I'm just going to repeat that one more time, because I want you to sort of get this concept really clear. Becoming masterful at setting boundaries requires the art of being able to tune into yourself, meaning your own feelings and needs, while you are in the presence of others and interacting with them. And we're going to talk a lot about what this means. But first, let's try to understand why we lost touch with boundaries in the first place, why we lost touch with ourselves to a certain degree. Well, first and foremost, as we get raised in this condition of socialization as we're growing up, this sort of classical conditioning system of punishment and reward, we learn as a result of this biological fear of abandonment that we have to basically hyper-focus externally on what our caregivers are doing, what they want from us, what they expect from us, in order to stay safe. Because we're aware at a subconscious level that we are completely dependent on our caregivers for survival, especially in the earliest chapters of our lives. So this becomes especially prevalent, this hypervigilance, this hyper-focus on the people around you, your caregivers growing up, becomes especially prevalent if we have unpredictable caregivers. So let's look at anxiously attached individuals, for example. They tend to have quite consistent caregivers when the caregivers are present, but there's a strong inconsistency of the caregivers being present versus having to be maybe at work, or the difference between how present one caregiver is from the other. And that inconsistency creates more hypervigilance, which is part of why you often see anxious preoccupied attachment styles struggling a lot more with boundaries than some of the other attachment styles. And the same thing goes for fearful avoidance. Fearful avoidance usually had consistent inconsistency. At least the anxious preoccupied could determine, like, hey, if my caregiver is here, they're usually nice and they're safe, but they're often not, and that's what they feel inconsistent around. The fearful avoidant often doesn't know how to even predict their caregivers while they're in the presence of them. And this can be because they have caregivers who are, emotionally unavailable sometimes, maybe struggling with addiction, violence, a temper, rage, depression, anxiety, these different things. And so the fearful avoidant child is like, I love my caregiver, I want to connect to them, but I can't predict them and I don't feel safe around them. So they become especially hypervigilant. And this really correlates with my research around boundaries, which says fearful avoidants tend to struggle the most with boundaries as a general rule because of their conditioned patterns. Anxious preoccupied tend to struggle the next most. And then dismissive avoidants tend to be hyper strong with their boundaries in terms of their needs, but less so with their emotions, because part of their conditioning growing up was that they had to fend for themselves a lot more emotionally and with their needs. So they learned to really rely on themselves, be hyper vigilant about their relationship to themselves, and be tuned out of what people expect from them a lot more so. And so secures, by comparison to all of this, secure attachment styles tend to be quite good with their boundaries naturally. They feel safe, they can tune into themselves while being in the presence and company of others, and so they can speak up for themselves a lot more easily in real time. And setting effective boundaries and being clear about what our boundaries are is a very important part of transitioning into a healthy attachment style. So anxious preoccupieds and fearful avoidants probably find themselves struggling with boundaries the most of anybody. Now, classical conditioning, this whole process, conditions us as a whole, no matter what your attachment style is, to a certain degree, to hyper focus on our external environment as well. This isn't just in the home. This is at school. You have to meet the expectations of your teachers, your peers. And so as a result, even irrespective of your attachment style, we do tend to have a certain degree of disconnection from ourselves, our own feelings and needs, as an adaptation to try to fit into our environment and adjust and be socialized growing up. And as a result of this, the primary casualty sort of becomes the relationship to ourselves. Now, trauma is basically something that we couldn't process emotionally at a certain period of time in our lives. And so because our brain couldn't properly process and make sense of and make peace with, we stored it subconsciously instead as a fear or as a wound. And we reorganized our nervous system and our natural responses to similar things around this unresolved wound or problem. And so attachment trauma and boundaries are highly correlated, right? We reorganized our automatic responses towards hyper-focusing on what's outside of us, and we disconnected from our sense of self as a result, okay? And this is what's happened to everybody to a certain degree. We became hyper-focused on everything around us, other people, what people expect from us and need from us, and that created a pain point of disconnection within ourselves. And part of setting boundaries requires getting back in touch with this part and really healing that trauma or that wound. So for some of you on your journey, you might be rebuilding that connection quite quickly. Some other attachment styles, we can't even get that connection until we're back with ourselves again. Like, it's not uncommon for me to see individuals like fearful avoidance, for example, who like crave connection, want love, want closeness, but then they feel exhausted when they're around other people. And they need to go and isolate or become reclusive to get that connection back with themselves again, because they are not aware of how disoriented they are, disconnected they are from their own boundaries in real time with people. And this can be part of why fearful avoidance go from being like anxious and wanting that connection need to needing to pull back and become so avoidant. So there's a little bit more I want to touch on in terms of why else we lose touch. And I want to go in a little bit to codependency and some of the fears around setting boundaries that can take place. But I'm going to give you some time to just take everything in so far, see what shows up for you, and we'll dive a little bit more into why we lose touch in the next part of this module. So other than just the way we are conditioned, so some of this process of us needing to be hyper-focused externally, to stay safe, to adapt to our environment with our caregivers, or even just to adopt and become socialized in the society that we grow up in the school environment with teachers and peers and all these different social pressures that are going on. Another main reason that we can lose touch with our boundaries is because we are raised in a codependent or enmeshed family dynamic. So what is enmeshment? Enmeshment is essentially this concept or idea that can be taught within families or groups of people that we are supposed to all sacrifice for each other. There are no personal lines or needs or boundaries, right? And it is essentially the needs of the collective that are primary. And so as a result of this, when we're taught this and we're conditioned to see our relationships this way, the children of these enmeshed family dynamics learn to associate the feelings of others as their primary feelings as well. So the child often associates their parents' feelings as their own and the parents' needs as their own, because there's such a blur between where one person begins and another person ends. So if we have direct enmeshed values, we'll hear things like, oh, family always saves family. Everybody has to bail each other out. Everybody has to pick up each other's messes. And there is a beautiful component to that. It's beautiful to know that like people are there to support each other, like sort of ride or die, always going to show up to help each other out. But one of the really big pain points here is that we can really take on people's problems and challenges around us as if they are our own. And it can really hurt and cause a lot of unnecessary suffering, because everybody's going to go through their challenges in life. And if we're constantly taking on not just ours, but everybody around us, then that creates a lot more stress in our personal lives. And number two, and most importantly probably, when everybody's bailing each other out all the time, this doesn't teach personal and natural responsibility and accountability for ourselves and our own lives, which is a sort of rite of passage of moving completely into adulthood. And so it's very important to become aware of this as well. And often parents in enmeshed dynamics can fall into a trap of parentifying their kids. They tell the kids all their problems emotionally, the problems in the marriage, what's going on, the problems in their personal and financial lives. And the kids can often take these things on very dramatically. And again, here are the children taking on the parents' feelings as if they are their own. And then we naturally bring this into our adult romantic relationships, our friendships, all these different places, because these are the rules we've been taught about how to relate to others. And then it's not uncommon that these children grow up and they parentify their own kids and they don't have lines in their own relationships. And so there can sort of be this generational teaching of enmeshment and codependency that gets passed down unless we learn about the importance of being able to tune into ourselves, take ourselves into consideration in the process of making decisions, and create compromises instead of sacrifices. And I'm going to go into a lot about what that means a little bit later in this course, but the basic principle I want you to understand now is that there's a huge difference between everybody just sacrificing for each other and not tuning into their own feelings and needs at the expense of, themselves and trying to save everybody else in their family or help everybody else or, run to any problems that can occur in the family dynamic. There's a big difference between that versus being able to take yourself into consideration when you're seeing other people go through challenges and problems and provide support in a way that doesn't create a sacrifice, doesn't hurt you in the process, and is a compromise based on what your needs are and the other person's needs. And that leaves room for the other person to grow while also being supported. And so a compromise is a very healthy adaptation. And one thing that I will commonly see in enmeshed families is that everybody actually struggles to get ahead long term in their lives, to save the appropriate amount of money, to advance in their careers, to have healthy interpersonal relationships, because people often stay in this fight or flight mode of trying to fix and save and go into emergency mode and change everybody else's problems and outcomes. And this takes a lot of energy out of life long term. So it's just an important piece to become aware of. And again, we're going to go into a lot of how to change these things long term. And so these are the more direct enmeshed values. Like these are the expectations that are taught. Family always saves family. We always sacrifice for each other. Then there's the indirect enmeshment dynamic. And what I tend to see here is that the indirect enmeshment dynamic takes place when children, because they are naturally and biologically hyper attuned to their caregivers when they're born, at a very young age, they sense their own parents' helplessness, pain, addiction, fear, sadness, depression, anything that they're going through. And if that parent is going through a very taxing or challenging emotional time, the child takes that on and is afraid to rock the boat because the child naturally senses that, oh my goodness, my parent is going through so much. If they don't survive, I might not survive. So I have to become extremely good about not rocking the boat, not causing any problems or challenges. And so they make this adaptation to try to fix or save the parent's pain by being very, very good themselves as a subconscious strategy to maintain their own safety. And so these are the main pieces of why we lose touch with ourselves and why we lose touch with our boundaries as a result and become hyper-focused on what's going on outside of us. And all of these things are essentially minor to large-scale trauma points. So in review there just a little bit, it's the classical conditioning system, okay, the way that we're taught to naturally be socialized in our environment, and that takes place in the household or also in the community with teachers, peers, loved ones, parents, all of the above. And then we also have the enmeshed dynamics, which can be either direct, where we're literally taught enmeshed family values, or indirect, where there's more of this, the child's attuned to the caregiver who's going through pain, and they pick up on this and they fear it, and so they adapt in order to try to stay safe. Okay, so all of these things can create these disconnects from ourselves. And as a result of these, we can have fears around setting boundaries in general. So essentially, underneath our lack of boundaries in our adult lives are just fears that have been programmed into the subconscious. So we're going to have two layers of fears that take place. One is our primary layer of fears, and the other is our secondary. And both layers of fears here, in terms of these beliefs that we adopt that create this fear of setting boundaries, have to do with the messaging we receive in our environments growing up that create this belief that we can set boundaries. Okay, so for example, our primary layers, we will see I will be unsafe if I set boundaries. Okay, and this can be because, again, that was the family dynamic you were taught. You would be punished or yelled at if you tried to set a boundary, or you saw your caregiver in pain and you didn't want to do anything to rock the boat, and so you don't set the boundary because you're like, something bad could happen to them and then me. So we have, I will be unsafe, I am likely to be abandoned, rejected, I will be unworthy or unloved. Okay, maybe you tried setting boundaries a few times growing up and you got really shamed, punished for it, or put in time out and ignored. And so you received these really intense messages that you were going to be unloved. There's something wrong with you if you have a boundary, you're defective. And so as a result of these core belief patterns, your lack of setting boundaries was literally a survival response to try to stay safe and connected in your environment. And this is why people can have such strong fears around setting boundaries and they can feel so real and so gripping, is because we can literally have this subconscious program or association that says you setting boundaries is literally going against your need for survival. Okay? Then we have a secondary layer. And these are the other messages that we got, usually a little bit later in childhood, or just, even in our teenage years, or other relationships in our adult lives. And these are things like, hey, you're a burden if you try to set boundaries. Because, maybe we have a single parent who's like, I'm doing so much for you. My life is so hard. How could you possibly ask me to drive you to your friend's house? Don't you see that I'm already doing so much? And the messaging they give you indirectly is like, you're already a burden to have to take care of. Anything else you request is a further burden. And so the messaging you receive is like, oh my gosh, I feel guilty for even needing boundaries or having personal requests. And think about, on that secondary layer there, how that impacts you in your adult romantic relationships. Not even from the unsafe and all those really hard things on the primary layer, but just like, if you think having a need is a burden to another person, how does that impact the way you interact in your relationships, your friendships even? Things like you're undeserving. You don't deserve boundaries. If you were performing more in school, then you can have a need or a feeling. But because you're not performing, you don't deserve. And so it's like, wow, I have to earn my boundaries. I'm not entitled to them as a person. They're not part of healthy relating or a healthy relationship. I have to earn boundaries. Really poor messaging, right? You're a bad person if you have boundaries, oh, you're selfish. How dare you? These types of things. Maybe you go against the enmeshed family dynamic and you're shamed for it, right? And you're made to feel like you're a bad person. Or you were guilted for setting boundaries in other ways, punished, yelled at, blamed, all these sorts of things. So some of the secondary messaging we get are those components, and also things like boundaries cause conflict. Boundaries equals taking from other people. There isn't enough to go around. So if I set a boundary here, it's going to have a negative impact on the relationship over there. And so obviously all these different pieces of messaging we get, either at the primary survival response layer or even just the secondary interpersonal relating layer, being guilted, called bad, thinking that you're selfish, all of these things deeply impact the way we show up and choose whether or not to set boundaries in our adult relationships. And without boundaries in our adult relationships, we have a hard time functioning without toxicity. So in the next module, we're going to go into a little bit about considering ourselves, how we stop considering ourselves, and how to do that going forward. Do you remember I was saying earlier that part of the art of setting boundaries is the art of taking ourselves into consideration when making our decisions? I really want to highlight this. So as a result of all of those different challenges we went through in terms of being hyper-focused on our external environment and adapting to our culture and social norms and expectations from others, and sort of trying to figure out the world as we're growing up, this big, huge world that we're sort of confronted with, it's really easy to learn in order to adapt to sort of forget about what you're feeling and needing in real time because you're so busy being hyper focused on everybody else. And when this becomes repetitive over time, that's your way of handling decisions or handling situations that include or involve other people, that becomes a program in your subconscious. It sort of gets wired in there that, hey, I make decisions based on going outside in instead of inside out, right? So you're making decisions from like what the external impact is before considering yourself instead of considering yourself first and then working to compromise with the external world. And so it is extremely common, especially for unhealthy attachments, specifically fearful, avoidant, and anxious, to get really lost in the mix and have a tough time considering themselves when making choices and decisions in their lives. Now, as a general rule, secures do this a little more naturally, and dismissive avoidants do this almost hypervigilantly because that was their adaptation, was to go in the opposite direction. Hey, nobody's really looking out for me. I have to be, number one to myself. Whereas fearful avoidance and anxious preoccupied tend to get the messaging that if you fit in, if you do what we need from you, you get rewarded and you get your needs met. Right? So there became this different adaptation there, which obviously makes for further friction between the dismissive avoidant and the fearful avoidant or anxious preoccupied styles, right? It makes for an easy perceived imbalance, which creates those breeding grounds for conflict. So, what does this really mean? Well, taking ourselves into consideration really means first noticing our feelings as a guidance system when something is off. So, if somebody violates a boundary, to be able to tune into your feelings and know what you're feeling in real time as it's taking place so that you can recognize, oh, something doesn't feel right. And then, number two, recognizing what you would need to feel better or to feel relief in that situation. And ideally, even though for some of you this might sound like a big leap, we can take ourselves into consideration and notice these things in real time while they are happening and be able to respond in a way that's healthy. So the third sort of thing is to be able to take that feeling that something's off, the recognition of what you would need to make it feel better, and then to be able to express in a kind yet assertive way as immediately as possible. And this is how to sort of consider ourselves in real time while we are in the presence or company of others. Or we are naturally, even better, right? Proactively, we can take ourselves into consideration when making any decisions in the first place. So we're doing this before there is anything that could be off, right? Somebody asks us for something, let's say somebody asks you for a ride to the airport before you have a deadline. You would go, wait, do I have the opportunity to take this person to the airport without it sacrificing something in myself and maybe causing problems for me in my life? And so maybe you say, hey, I can take you part way. Or maybe you say, I'm so sorry, I can't take you, but good luck, maybe next time. And you try to just extend emotional support. But either way, you're considering yourself in that process. Versus, sometimes what we'll see is you're like, oh, somebody asked me for something, I have to say yes. You're driving the person to the airport and you're stressing about the deadline and you're freaking out inside. You drop the person, you leave, and then you're resentful or frustrated at that person when it was actually you that violated your own boundary in the first place without meaning to, because you didn't have that natural programming in place to consider yourself in your decision-making process. Now, another example, okay, when we have to use our feelings of the guidance system is when we have a boundary violation that we didn't ask for. We didn't get a request around. So somebody just speaks rudely to you in the workplace, right? So you didn't get a question, hey, can you take me to the airport? Somebody just did something that violated a personal boundary for you. And in that case, you have to ask yourself, what do I need to feel better? And how can I express this in a healthy way? And we're going to go through a step-by-step process later on in this course to really dig into that and see it. I want you to remember that a no to someone else might be a yes to yourself, and thus a yes to the health and well-being of that relationship. Okay, so by proactively saying no sometimes to things that don't work for you, that might benefit your relationship long term because you don't fall into the resentment trap. Okay, so in the next module here, we're going to go through the different types of boundaries and boundary violations, and we're going to dig a little bit more into really what boundaries are and what they look like so that we can learn the exact processes we need to set them